Hello, my name is Jim Johnson with D2000 Safety, and in this short presentation we'd like to look at basic confined space definitions. If you're responsible for identifying confined spaces at your location, I think this talk will be of some benefit to you. So in this short program we would like to cover the definition of a confined space, the definition of a permit required confined space, and then we'll also look at non-permit required confined spaces, which are also called reclassified spaces. We will talk more about reclassification in another video. Now, most people who have some familiarity with the confined space standard know that a confined space has these three characteristics. It's large enough to enter, it has limited access and egress, and it wasn't designed for continuous occupancy. But it's important for you to understand how each of these three characteristics are in turn defined. Let's start with large enough to enter and perform work. The intent of the confined space standard was to protect people who are going into things from harm. So the writers of the standard wanted to make sure that they were focusing on things that people were actually going into. They didn't want to look at things like 55-gallon drums or small fuel tanks or other tight configurations that people may only lean into or reach into, something like this. If you don't actually go into the space, and if there's not enough room within that space for you to perform some useful work, then it's not going to be considered a confined space. It may have all kinds of hazards, but we're not going to use the confined space regulations to deal with those hazards. The second thing we want to look at is limited entry and exit. Again, going back to the confined space standard, the folks who wrote the standard wanted to make sure that if the space was such that people could easily run out of that space to get away from the hazards, then again it wouldn't be covered under the confined space regulations. They wanted to focus on those spaces where it was difficult or impossible for people to quickly get away, get to a point of safety if in fact a hazard developed. So the concept of limited entry and exit openings is best understood by looking at the hazard in that space and how easy is it for people to get away. In most cases we simply look at the size of the opening. If people have to crawl or bend or stoop to get out, then we would consider that to be limited access and egress. If the people have to climb a ladder or perhaps get up some stairs under heat or atmospheric hazard or something like that where it makes it difficult to get out of that space, we're going to consider that to be limited access and egress as well. Now, confined spaces have all been designed by someone, usually an engineer of some kind, and when that engineer sat down to design that space, he or she had a list of criteria that space had to meet. Certain volume, chemical feed, retention time, wall thickness, all these characteristics. So the question comes up, when that designer put that space, the design of that space together, did they consider the fact that people would be going into that space under normal operating conditions? If that's the case, the designer would have included things like lighting, non-skid walking surfaces, noise abatement, ventilation. If your space has these kinds of characteristics, it means that the individual who designed that space took into account the safety and health of humans who would have to go into that space. If it doesn't have those kinds of things, then again, not designed for continuous occupancy, that would be the trait of a confined space. So if we have these three characteristics, large enough to enter and perform work, limited entry and exit openings, and not designed for continuous occupancy, if we have all three of those things, we're going to consider that space to be a confined space.